Hey everyone, welcome to Tech Strategies in a Crisis with Thoughtworks. I appreciate everybody joining and taking a little bit of time out of your schedule. Hopefully you'll find this helpful and significant benefit for you. I see the participant list growing, so that's great. My name is Nathan Ellsbury with Thoughtworks, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm also going to be joined by Mike Mason and Martin Fowler. Do a little bit of an intro with them here in just a second. A couple of housekeeping things. Everybody's already muted, so no need to fiddle with any of that. You'll be muted for the remainder of the webinar session, but you do have a voice from the questions perspective. You can submit your questions via the Zoom panel so that we can read those questions and make sure that we're addressing them. And if you do have a question that you've submitted that we don't get to, or if you come up with additional questions after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via thoughtworks.com via our Contact Us page, and we can certainly address those questions for you separately outside of this recording. And this recording will be provided later in the week so that everybody can take another look at it or pass on to your friends and colleagues for them to take a look at. So appreciate you joining again. So I mentioned that I'm joined by Mike and Martin. Martin Fowler, for anyone who doesn't know, is our chief scientist. He has 2 decades of experience helping corporations evolve and utilize technology for mission critical information systems, and is a renowned author. Authored the Agile Software Manifesto and 7 award-winning books on software development. Martin is passionate about designing software systems to maximize the productivity of delivery teams, allowing them to respond to the changing needs of customers fast. Mike Mason is our global head of technology. He guides the Thoughtworks strategic technology direction, builds our tech capacity, and ensures the success of our client deliveries. Mike's passionate about applying cutting-edge technology to business problems and helping organizations understand how technology can be a critical part of their business strategy. So those are the folks joining me today. Mike and Martin, I appreciate you taking the time out and helping some of the folks that are part of this webinar right now learn a little bit better how to handle tech strategy in a crisis.
Happy to be here.
Good. So without further ado, I want to get into the first topic, which is around remote working. And I was actually reading an article last week from a strategy consulting firm talking about remote work being BAU and remote work being something that everybody's already doing. It seems to be going well. And when I first read that, I was a little frustrated. I was thinking that's not right. There's all this other stuff to it. But when I really dug into what they were saying, they're right. Remote work and/or punching the clock remotely, logging into your laptop and getting on Zoom and doing something throughout the day. Yes, that's BAU. I think everybody can log into their laptop. Everybody's downloaded Zoom. What's not BAU is remote governance, remote facilitation, remote organizational alignment when it comes to, you think about a number of companies that are out there and a lot of the folks that are on this webinar. It's hard enough to get alignment between IT and business and product in a normal environment where everybody's in the same building, everybody's meeting on a recurring basis. We're not in remote work situation. We are in, and I'm stealing this term from Martin and some others, that we're in a emergency forced work from home situation. And it's really difficult. So this is not remote work. This is something entirely different that we're dealing with. And I want to ask you guys a little bit about your experience last week, because we went through an experience internally where we were preparing for our Tech Radar, which we do. And it's a group of some of the best minds at Thoughtworks and probably other places that are getting together and working on really intricate, really detailed, really technical things. And it was never designed to be done remotely, yet last week it was executed remotely. So why don't you guys tell us a little bit about how that went, lessons learned, takeaways, advice for others when they're doing similar things?
Yeah, I guess I'll start and say, yeah, this is a meeting that we do twice a year. and we've been doing it for over 10 years now. And we get essentially a bunch of technical leaders from around the world. We all go to some place and we spend 4 days in a meeting, of which the main piece is hashing together the tech radar, although we do some other stuff as well usually. So as a result, one consequence of this is we're pretty familiar with both the process and each other. I mean, we've been working together quite a long time. We had one new person in this time, but she already knew quite a few of the people around the group anyway. So it wasn't a case of people having to collaborate on something where they didn't know everybody else. And also, other than that one person, we'd all done this several times before. So we were very familiar with the process. And it was a case of taking what is actually a fairly structured process. We go through all of these candidate things that we're going to put on the radar, the blips, and we discuss them and we vote on whether to accept them or not and whether to move them from where they're originally proposed. It's a fairly structured approach to things, and we're familiar with how we do that in the room. So translating that, I think that makes a big difference when it comes to doing something like that remotely, because we have that familiarity and it is something that is pretty structured.
I think everybody was kind of pleased and slightly surprised by how well things actually went last week. Something that we had to do, it's a global meeting. We had 20 people in 12 countries. One of the things we had to do was pick a time slot for it. So, this happens a lot in many organizations, is that you're distributed over multiple countries and time zones, and you have to figure out how you're gonna deal with that. What we did was we picked kind of a 6-hour chunk and decided that was the meeting time. And then unfortunately, some people, got the short end of the stick on that, but we're actually, we had folks in Australia and India and China who kind of adjusted their schedules to be up kind of doing the night shift for them and being part of the meeting. And we also formed some subgroups as well that were at slightly friendlier hours for those particular people, so that they could participate as well. Part of this was enabled by a magical spreadsheet that encapsulated the process that we usually do with lots of, it's Thoughtworks, so it's all physical stuff and stickies and cards and all that kind of thing. And we basically digitized all of that. That actually went really well. I think what was interesting, though, is that we have the advantage of being working over video a lot with each other. So we all kind of knew how to do that. Most people in Thoughtworks have decent audio-visual setups and usually reasonable internet. And that can be a major factor. And certainly the audio is a major piece. I think people underestimate how important that is. I think there were a few downsides. We did a retrospective at the end, and some people said it was rather clinical. So, we did exactly the job that we had to do. And there wasn't any, there wasn't the human stuff, right? Rebecca, the CTO of Thoughtworks, uses this meeting in part when it's in person to get advice to her as a CTO. And that really wasn't a factor in the meeting. And often we'll do things like, if there's a particularly thorny issue where we can't agree on something, maybe some people will discuss that at dinner and then come back the next day with sort of a proposal to go forward. We were able to do it, but then there was certainly some things that we were not able to recreate with the remote meeting.
Yeah, the lack
you just
of
mentioned something. So
conversations were really.
I was going to ask about you said folks would talk about it at dinner, and I thought that was interesting because I was trying to think about the separate catch-ups that happen in a normal environment where you're working and you're all sitting in a meeting room all day, and then maybe you go out for dinner and drinks and you discuss, and then you come back in smaller groups, you come back in the next day and you talk about that. And I kind of was equating that to stand-ups or other things that, folks have to meet and then they have to go off in either smaller groups or individually take action or do something, and then they come back together. How do you do some of those things in a remote environment, or how did you guys do it? Where, did you have virtual dinners or virtual drinks afterwards, or virtual small groups that would then come back together?
No, and then that's what we lose, right? I mean, when you've got 6 hours of Zoom calls, the last thing you want to do is spend another hour doing a virtual drinks, right? Especially if you're in Australia and it's 4 o'clock in the morning. So
Fair enough.
you can't do that. And also another part of this is, and this is what I was getting to in, as you asked your question, is a lot of the kind of little small group conversations. You know, we take a break for, you know, even a 10-minute break where it's primarily so that people can go to the loo. People have little conversations, and people might have a half-formed idea that they don't want to really bring up to the whole group, but they want to bounce it off somebody who they feel, oh yeah, if I talk to Eric about this and he doesn't react badly, maybe it's a worthwhile idea to bring to the group. That just ain't going to happen in a call like this. So there's lots of interactions that go missing. And another thing that also I didn't point out, this group also meets regularly by video call every week or 2 weeks, depending on the different combinations of people. So we actually have a regular video interaction. We don't actually do this process other than face-to-face twice a year. And you talk to people who do regular remote working. So one group that is very vocal about remote first working is the people that do Basecamp. And the Ruby on Rails stuff, David Hennemeyer Henson and crew. I mean, they work all the time remotely. They're a remote first organization, very aggressively so, but 2 or 3 times a year they get together and meet face to face. And there's real importance in that part of it, even in a regular remote organization, let alone when you're flung into having to do something remotely like this. So it's important to realize there are absolutely things that you cannot replace. And in this situation, you just have to say, well, we're in the middle of a crisis. We're going to have to deal with it. And it'll be an interesting question for the next radar, because we have no idea whether we'll be able to do it face to face or not.
I think the other thing that seems a bit obvious, but like remote facilitation is a skill that, is very important right now. A lot of people are just taking something that was an in-person co-located process and activity, and then just kind of digitizing it directly. And that can sort of work, but you also should be taking the opportunity to rethink what you're trying to achieve, and whether simple digitization and translation is the thing you should do, or whether there's new ways of thinking and new pieces of process. A friend of mine 4 weeks ago was ranting about this at me, because he works for a highly remote organization. And he said, when we do a retrospective, people spend 10 minutes typing in their things for the retrospective, and then we can spend 50 minutes, if it's an hour conversation, we can spend 50 minutes talking about the stuff. Whereas if you do it physically, everybody spends half an hour fiddling around with stickies and stuff. And he was saying, actually, that's so purely transplanting is a bad idea, and you do need to rethink things for remote first.
You can't.
No, that's good.
I think it's important to realize that we are in a crisis situation. We are going to be making it up as we go along. We can't leap to a great answer first shot. And often a good way of doing it is to make a fairly limited step, but always to look at it and say, how can we evolve and get things better? I mean, if we're forced to do this remotely in the future, we will do things differently, because we'll look back at what we did in the past and make some changes.
And I think, I mean, Martin, I would say, even if if we are able to have an in-person meeting, I think we would run it slightly differently, because of some of the tech that we have applied last week. Some of the things were actually really quite good for productivity. There were downsides, but then there were benefits as well. And I think we would carry some of those forwards, even though that they were sort of foisted upon us in this crisis situation.
No, that's good to know, and I appreciate you guys going into it. For everybody on the webinar, this is a series, so in a couple of weeks, we're going to have the next component of this series where we're going to deep dive into some of the specifics around remote governance, remote facilitation, and some of the other things that I mentioned, so we'll deeper dive on that. Right now, let's pivot over to what I like to call digital triage. And it's a little bit of a phraseology change from what we're normally talking about as Thoughtworks, helping our partners become more modern digital businesses and doing so through a holistic digital transformation. But in today's world, I think that has to shift a little bit. I mean, we are hearing from potential clients, other partners, and other folks that they've got, as an example, a 200-person offshore vendor team that's been working on something for them for years. And now in this current environment, they can no longer afford to pay that X million dollar a month run rate for that vendor to continue doing what they were doing. But they can't just let them go because it's been treated as a black box up until now, because that vendor's been doing a great job and churning things out for them. So they can't afford it. They need the work that they're producing. They don't understand it. They don't have the capacity in-house to actually execute on it. I mean, we've got companies that are furloughing, that are laying off, that are going through some of these challenges right now. So how do they handle that? What type of digital triage activities can they take so that they're not held hostage by a particular software that they don't necessarily know how to use, by a program that they need, but they can no longer afford to execute? And that's where the triage component comes in, because it's not this holistic, all-encompassing digital transformation, but it's little areas of triage to try to get them through this crisis scenario and make sure that they come out the other side better than they went in. Any suggestions or thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of these things, the most important things to do were the things that should have been done 2 or 3 years ago. Being able to cope with these kinds of crises you need to shift to a team that's able to operate under greater uncertainty. And there's no quick way of doing that if you're not already partly there. I mean, the managerial stuff you can kind of get going in a few months or so. And this is what the Agile Fluency model brings out. But the technical stuff, knowing how to do testing well and continuous delivery, that can take a year or two to get a team to be able to get to that kind of pace. So I'm not saying that necessarily to say, oh my God, I told you should have been doing this and you've got to, go away and die or whatever. But to point that, don't expect that you're going to be able to kind of twist rapidly, because this stuff takes time. But having said that, there may be that also might give you some clues. Particularly in a big organization, there's probably some teams that were actually doing this and trying to get this done a couple of years ago, and you may not really fully realize what you have. So one thing might be looking around for people who are doing this style of work, because those are the teams that might be able to work much more quickly in this kind of style. But they may not have been sufficiently appreciated because the managerial structure wasn't looking for them. So it might be worth poking around. You might be surprised to see what you've got.
I think there's definitely a theme of accelerating the ability to get things into production. I mean, we're seeing governments around the world right now trying to respond to the crisis by providing extra benefits for citizens, for example. But even if they get legislation passed to try to help with, emergency funding and so on, the systems underlying that are demonstrating their age and creakiness. If you're looking at a lot of kind of, say, government benefit systems, they would be operating on a 1-year cycle where new legislation would come in and you'd get lots of notice on needing to make a change. And now we're stuck with systems where, if you only ever put something into production every 6 months, this current crisis is really shining a light on that as a problem. So one thing we're recommending is using this as a forcing function to really look at your path to production, really start to automate the way things get into production, really look at continuous delivery techniques, building up a true DevOps culture, and really accelerating that way of getting into production. We had an example from a UK client, a retailer, who needed to spin up a new test environment. And this was post-COVID, so this is during the crisis. They needed to spin up a new test environment, and they had the automation for their infrastructure as code, we call it, about half done. And rather than, ignoring that and manually spinning up the environment, what they did was they put the effort in to get that infrastructure as code over the line so that they could, automatically in minutes spin up that new environment and get going on that. So they used it as an excuse to get a piece of work done that had kind of stalled for them. I think the other thing that I would say is, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in there because I like the way that you said that they used it as an excuse, because this is an opportunity where it's not just about battening down the hatches and going into a hole and making sure that you continue. This is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to overcome hurdles maybe that have been there in the past that now aren't necessarily quite the hurdles that they were. So you can spin this current situation in a way that can help. You can drive change that was much more difficult to drive as it was in the past. And I think I was giving you an example earlier, like if you're listening to a lot of the advertisements that are coming out right now from an auto manufacturers, in the past, it's always been a challenge for them to get the click to buy model that you see with Tesla or with Carvana or something like that, for them to execute on that because of the dealer networks. And now I'm seeing that that's rapidly changing. It's a conversation that's been ongoing for years, but in this current environment, it has to change. So there are other ways that folks can leverage the current situation to benefit and to make a change within their business.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, if there are things that it's not like yesterday's plans are all junk, it's that we need to prioritize, right? Like we need to be looking at what are we going to do in the next 90 days for some organizations to stay afloat. There is an aspect of battening down the hatches in terms of cash flow and all that kind of thing, but there's also an opportunity. Everything is going online. CIOs are realizing that the fancy digital systems that they've invested in over the last few years, maybe don't actually handle the load that we had hoped they would. I don't know whether you guys have had the experience of going to, a grocery retailer and trying to use their delivery service stuff. But it turns out, a lot of those things are not great user experiences and are not handling the load very well. And so there's an aspect of making sure that you are starting to think about building resiliency, both into your systems. So are your systems able to scale and deal with outages and all that kind of stuff? But then also resiliency as an organization. Do you have a business where it's easy to understand how your business strategy flows into your technology execution, and your strategic intent is translated into the work that people do? Do you understand whether the things that you're investing in are giving the right payoff? Measuring stuff is very difficult. A lot of people are stuck with kind of lagging indicators. Now is the time to figure out what the leading indicators are for those initiatives and start measuring that stuff. Kill the things that aren't working, double down on the things that are working. What you just said about the auto manufacturers is interesting to me, because there's been many excuses over the years for that. Political stuff, people fighting for their own corner, or, doing a little bit of empire building. And what we're seeing today, on many fronts, that's out the window. We're all trying to survive. Yep. We're all going to collaborate. All of that stuff is out the window. So to me, it's a really good time to push through those things that were previously a problem and an excuse, and really work on how we're going to come out the other side. Because there's going to be a point, nobody knows when exactly, when kind of the restrictions start to be lifted, the investment dollars free up. We really need to know what we're going to do when we come out of this the other side, and how we're going to position, tactically in the meantime.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's good for everybody to start thinking about the changes in their business, because things are moving from on-site to online. There's going to be a need for much more AI chat bots in certain instances. So this digital triage is all about finding those particular areas that are important. Now, and it doesn't mean that the foundational items that you guys were originally talking about, the path to production, needs to be expedited, and not boiling the ocean and trying to kick off these monster programs right now in a world where we don't even know in 2 to 3 months what it's going to look like, but actually trying to attack things in a much more targeted way during these times of struggle. So that's really good. I appreciate you guys going through that. The next one I want to talk about is upskilling. So, the scenario we talked about in triage was, or the example that I gave was about trying to pull back work from a particular vendor, or maybe trying to remove a software license that you've been paying that you can no longer afford, or building a better path and a quicker path to production, all of these things. Well, how do you not only upskill your existing workforce to be able to do those things if they're not currently capable of doing those things, but how do you optimize that workforce? Because it's not just about getting people more educated and allowing them to do better, but again, we're dealing with furloughs and layoffs and other things that are there. So what used to be 10 people is now 5 people or something like that. And so you have to optimize your workforce at the same time as you're trying to upskill them. So any thoughts on how some of the attendees here can go about upskilling their workforce and optimizing the way that they're functioning today?
I mean, I would say that trust is a giant issue here, right? Like, everybody's working from home in an emergency, the kids are running around, and there's a definite nervousness. Are people putting in the hours that they should be? Are people paying attention to work? All that kind of thing. Are we? Martin has a great article on his website about the difficulty in measuring productivity, right? And I think that comes around here, and I'll let him talk about that if he wants to. But to me, trusting your people to be doing the right thing, even in this time of crisis, is hugely important, and then giving them the space to do so. We talk a lot about empowered teams. So giving teams kind of the space to move the needle on the measure or metric that they're trying to improve, and allowing them to figure out ways that they can improve themselves is hugely important. The other thing that I would say is, the talent shortage is not new. So this is still the same problem that companies have been dealing with for a long time, and the realization that outsourcing everything was actually a bad idea, and that we need a certain amount of tech capability in-house. You don't need all the skills, given how broad the technology landscape is, but you need to figure out which skills are we going to have in-house and which skills are we going to partner to have that capability.
Yeah, and we also need to remember you're not going to be as productive as normal, or even as in any comparison with any other kind of remote activity. This is not a normal situation. I've been remote working for decades, and I'm not as productive as normal. It's hard not to keep a worry about what's going on with the news and all the rest of it. I don't have kids either to look after, and that's even more wallops your productivity. So I think being understanding of that, but at the same time saying, okay, well, what can we do given the circumstances, but not losing sight of those circumstances, because I think how people how you work with people and treat people under a crisis says a lot about the kind of organization you are. And organizations that treat people badly, particularly given Mike's point that the talent race isn't going away, is going to be important as things turn around. Because what's going to really matter is when things do begin to turn, because that's when the opportunities often come. And if you're not well prepared for that, you're going to be in difficulty, and people are the key to it.
I'd also say there are some tech-enabled things that you can be doing. I mean, it's interesting for Thoughtworks as a consultancy, right? Because one of the things that clients are able to get from working with us is an uplift in their own capability, because client teams and Thoughtworks teams work together, A lot of that expertise can help to be transferred, and you know, new techniques come across and can help upskill people. And you would think that maybe that's more difficult now that we're in this kind of remote first world, but actually there's a lot of good tooling around you know, programmer collaboration at distance. You can do remote pairing. There's a whole bunch of things that you can continue to do to help people you know, upskill even remotely.
Yeah, this, one of the questions from Thanos, I think, brings out a point, and why one of the reasons I really hate this term upskill. I don't know. When I was a lad, it was called learning thing. And Thanos' comment is that he's saying that we need to intelligently downskill because people are bringing back legacy system stuff, old tech, and they need to figure out how to change it because they just haven't figured that out for ages instead of new tech. And you know, I suspect you'll agree with me. I don't see that as downskilling, right? Because it's learning something new. It just happens to be old tech. But if it's important because it's running your business, then you've got to do that. And that's something that's been put off for too long and needs to be dealt with. On a completely different dimension, of course, if you are needing to spin up some new capability, it may mean using completely wild new tech because that's what this, you know, Skunksworks-like team has got familiar with, or what you can do to get something into production quickly. You've got to start using cloud stuff aggressively. There's going to have to be some experimentation done if you want to put something new into production quickly. It may have to kind of bring a bonfire to your architectural standards and say, we're going to bring this system up, and what's more, we expect to throw this away in a year's time because, you know, if that's what we need to be able to cope with the next year, we're going to have to do that. And particularly since, you know, anything you build that's going to be useful in 2 months' time may not be useful in a year's time because the business and health landscape will have gone and changed again. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and therefore you've got to be able to work with that kind of rapid turnaround.
I mean, Martin made an interesting reference to legacy systems there. You know, this isn't really to do with the crisis, but the at Thoughtworks, we talk a lot about something called the 4 key metrics, which are basically DevOps metrics coming out of a book called Accelerate, which was last year or the year before. Fantastic book on what actually makes IT productive. And it turns out there's 4 fairly coarse-grained measures, cycle time, I'm going to forget them, cycle time, mean time to recovery, change fail rate, and one more that I've forgotten, that imply your IT productivity, like how good your IT department is going to be at powering the business. And those are like DevOps metrics, like how often can I get this thing into production? What was interesting about the research that they did was that those metrics are useful independent of the technology stack. So a lot of people would consider the older legacy systems, well, you simply can't engineer them to get them into production more quickly. Actually, that's not true. You can. So, you know, applying modern thinking about the characteristics that we want, even to older technology stacks, is still a very valid thing to do today.
Thinking about it from a motivational perspective, everybody says, "Oh, we're gonna do whatever we need to come out of this crisis better than we entered this crisis." And I think that, to Martin's point, the learning that we're talking about right now of the folks that are there, that's that long-term investment that will bring you out of this crisis in a better scenario than when you went in. If you have more folks that have learned, whether it's new technology, whether it's legacy technology or what it is, that's the long-term investment. And it sounds like you guys are both saying, I mean, that's a great way for companies to invest right now, to not only show their dedication to their employees, but to leave this crisis and come out of this crisis better than they went in, because their folks will have learned significantly more than they knew before. So I think it's great. I want to move on now to our last topic before we get into some of the questions. And that's around post-COVID planning or post-crisis planning. The crisis of the moment is COVID, but what should companies be doing to take action? And we alluded to this a little bit when we talked about digital triage and some things that could be done there to address it. But I'm thinking more along the lines of the larger transformation and the larger change, more holistic change that we've seen. And so many of those programs have been stopped or paused because they were happening. And then all of a sudden we get into this crisis and we need to hit the pause button. Others were planned and ready to kick off, but they've been canceled for whatever reason. But, whether that be financial, whether it be just simply waiting to see what happens on the outskirts of this crisis. But what can companies do today in order to prepare for what's next, whatever that might be? I mean, nobody here on this call has a crystal ball, so we don't know exactly what that is, but we do know that there are some critical actions and steps that can be taken to best prepare for whatever comes next. Thoughts on that?
Well, the first response I have to that is, I haven't a clue. And what's more, anybody who tells you they do have a clue, they don't really. They're just making it up. I've got no sense of what it'll be like to come out. We've got some senses of maybe some loosening of restrictions, which will probably have to get tightened again when, if things flare up, it's going to be very chaotic. And that's assuming that people are behaving competently in the political leadership. And I'm not necessarily spotting that in every country in the world at the moment. So it's going to be difficult. But there's a meta answer to that is, as a result, what you've got to do is you've got to focus on being able to handle unpredictable things and saying to yourself, I'm not going to be able to predict what's going to happen. So I've got to roll with that system. And of course, and then you get to kind of, I get very boring and predictable, because that's the whole basis on what the agile revolution and extreme programming was based on, was we're in a very unpredictable world, and we have to therefore be able to set up processes that work well with that. And that was the whole premise that we operated on when we started this stuff back in the late 90s. So it comes down to a lot of that kind of solid, boring stuff, boring to me maybe, of being able to cope with a very unpredictable world by not trying to attempt to predict what's going to happen, because you don't really know.
Yeah, and I think I would probably separate what's happening into a few different phases. Like right now, everybody's looking at their business fundamentals, worrying about securing cash flow, making sure that their employees are safe, that customers are safe if you're interacting with them, and that's really a sort of dealing with the moment. And then the next thing is really about starting to adapt. Something that Thoughtworks has been talking about for a long time is customer insight into what it is that your customers want. And that's going to become even more critical, because, being able to understand what customers want and then pivot the organization and pivot the technology systems to providing that thing, is what's going to keep you afloat as all of this stuff changes. And then longer term is to reinvent what we're doing as an organization. So each organization is going to need to figure out what they, what it means to be a car dealership in a digital first world.
Yep.
Something that we've been working on for a couple of years now is something we call the digital fluency model, which is one of those bigger models for doing digital transformation programs, right? In light of everything that's going on, we've narrowed that down to kind of a 90-day focus. It's all about activating some, tactical value for an organization in sort of a 90-day window. But because it's still built on a larger model of digital transformation, the stuff that you can do in that sort of short-term, immediate window is not kind of out of alignment with what you might do over a longer term.
That's what I was going to ask. So so that model that you were just describing, the digital fluency model, everything for the 90 days is planning on where we are today and adjusting, and we keep picking on the automotive industry, but we could also pick on call centers as an example where the folks that are taking the calls aren't there, and you need chatbots that are going to be stepping in. There are all kinds of examples that we could go through, but not only helping in the 90 days, but it's not lost effort, meaning in the grand scheme of things, when we come out the other side of this, you've executed on some of the smaller, more targeted, drilled down digital fluency type of exercise that you're describing, and you come out, now you want to do the holistic digital transformation. How does that piece then correlate back to the larger engagement and the larger goal of total digital transformation, excuse me?
Well, so, I mean, when I think about digital transformation, that's a highly tailored thing for each organization. Actually, I think for every person who uses the phrase digital transformation, they will mean something different when they say that. So, you know, for some people, it just means, you know, agile IT, right? When I use the phrase digital transformation, I think about technology-enabled business. So it's a bit of a bigger thing, but, you know, sometimes people mean moving to the cloud when they say digital transformation. So it's important to figure out what do you actually mean by that. And then I'd say it's highly personal for each organization. Like, where are you trying to get to? What is your vision and ambition for the company? What's the value that you're providing to customers? And then we talk about something called digital fluency, which is your level of adoption of digital tools and techniques across a number of different dimensions. And the amount of digital fluency that you need depends on where you're trying to get to and where you're at today. And so we've been helping customers build sort of longer term investment roadmaps to help shift the needle on that fluency for that organization. And what you can do with these smaller kind of surgical investments is you're still moving the needle on a bigger transformation. It's just you're doing things that are going to give you much more immediate payoff. I mean, I think one of the problems that you alluded to earlier was people are doing large programs of work. It's the standard in the industry is to not expect any value from something for, you know, on the order of years, you know, a couple of years. That's pretty standard. And, you know, that's just not, it's certainly not something that we would have advocated for. You know, I think thought workers get a little antsy if there's even anything longer than even, say, a 6-month horizon on delivering value. We would get antsy. I think the same goes for any digital transformation investments that you would be doing today, is to be looking for those, you know, 3 to 6 month payoffs, or maybe even shorter.
And that's one of those great opportunities you're describing it right now, where an organization has historically gone after those large programs of work that don't deliver value in the near term. But because of the crisis that we're in, if you're part of one of those organizations, leverage this crisis to shift that mindset towards quick, iterative delivery, iterative value creation that Mike was just describing. I really like that. Okay, so that's a lot of discussion on some of the things that we wanted to cover that we're hearing from partners and others, but I want to get to the questions. So I'll start going through a few of these and reading them out and seeing what folks think. First one here, compared to mixed meetings, in person and remote, do you think it's easier if everybody is remote rather than mixing it up and having some there, some not? What's the thought process there?
Yeah, I have a strong opinion on this. If a reasonable amount of the people are remote, then everybody has to be remote. So even if you've got 3 people in the same office, it makes sense for each to go into a separate room with their own laptop and be remote on there. Because the thing is that whenever you have this situation where the remote people are on one channel and the people in the same space are on a different channel, the meeting is split and the people in the remote are in a second class position. So you really want to get, that's I think part of the philosophy of the remote first thinking, is you treat the remote as the first class thing. Everybody acts remotely first. Okay, you're allowed to have a quick chat when you're going for a coffee together, but that's it. Everything that's kind of substantially has to be done remotely. And I do think that that's the case. Now, where it gets more awkward is where you've got 12 people and 2 people are remote. And then it's very hard to do that. Although if you really want to treat the remote people in a first class way, that's actually what you should do. It's just that when the center of gravity is so much that there's nearly everybody in the same place, then it gets much harder to do that. And then the remote people do end up treated as second class citizens. And you have to decide whether you're more comfortable with that or more comfortable with making the group all sit together. But when you have got a situation where, you know, a reasonable proportion of them are remote, then just make everybody remote. It's just much more effective that way.
All right. Next one, people are mostly talking about challenges, negative impact, or how they are adjusting to the COVID situation. But going beyond these, are we also seeing some advantage or good patterns emerging from this new way of working, which we can continue in the future? Are we looking at leveraging this naturally induced disruption? How and in what way can we explore this? I think we've talked a little bit about, you know, the way that you can spin this into some positives. I mean, it's certainly a negative situation for the world and for the individuals that are involved. There's no question about that, but there's some good that can come out of it in that, you know, leveraging this as an opportunity to change the way that you're thinking, change the way that you're executing. I don't know if Mike, Martin, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there will be some good things that will come out that we'll learn from it, but this is a bit early to tell, so I don't know what they are.
One of my colleagues lives in Chicago, and he said to me, so he lives near the lake, and he said, I can see the other side of the lake, and there's buildings, and I never knew they were there because I couldn't see them because of all of the, you know, because of smog and pollution. And, you know, to me, I think we've got a massive economic impact and a massive kind of personal life impact for everybody right now, and that's very sad. But there are some things that are, it's really nice to challenge co-location by default. You know, I think we at Thoughtworks, we're a traveling consultancy. We've been pushing something that we call distributed by default for the last 2 or 3 years now, which is really trying to help have teams, you know, not all on a client site and to split all that stuff up. And I think many more organizations are going to be open to that. And that's a net positive. I also think some of the stuff that we struggle with when we're trying to give advice is to get the right stakeholders in the room. And actually this whole remote first thing is in some ways making it easier to get a hold of those stakeholders in order to be able to plan things, have a good meeting, make decisions in a way that seems much easier than in person.
The next one is around any tips on pair programming remotely.
Well, I can't give personal tips because I don't do pair programming remotely, but I talk to lots of thought workers who do remote pair programming who find that it is definitely effective and can be done. In fact, at the radar thing we were discussing, we put it in a doc, did we? I can't remember now what we did with it. But we saw it as basically, yes, this is can be a standard process. There was an excellent article published on martinfowler.com, my website, on pair programming recently by 2 of our colleagues, Birgitta and Nina. And there's a little section on that, on remote pairing, and I shall post that into the chat, the link to it.
And we would say that, you know, good tooling is really important. A lot of people try to do, you know, pair programming remotely just via screen share, and you need an awful lot of bandwidth for that to work. There are some other tools, like there's a Visual Studio Code plugin that actually works within the IDE to give you a much better, faster, more responsive experience. This is the other thing, right? You know, we have colleagues around the world who are now being asked to do remote pairing. And sometimes they're being asked to do that in ways that don't make any sense. For example, across wide ranges of time zones. So, you know, even if you're able to, in theory, get everybody to collaborate on a project, you should still think about how to organize the work so that you have sensible teams formed, you know, so that the pairing is mostly within, you know, a couple of hours of time zone of each other, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Next one is, when you think about introducing new tools into the stack, what do you think decision makers are most focused on improving? Cost savings, performance, security? And I guess that's, you know, introducing new tools during this crisis that we're in.
It's a good question. I mean, part of the phrasing of the question is a little bit weird to me, which is, decision makers, right? Like who are making the decisions on tools? Hopefully people who are making decisions on tools are also the people who are using the tools day to day. One of the problems that we see a little bit in the industry is a schism between decision makers and implementers. So I would say the phrasing of the question implies that to me. It has my spidey senses tingling a little bit about that. I would say, now more than ever, we need to be listening to the people doing the work and to what they need to be more productive, more secure, whatever it is that they're worried about. I did see some, I think pragmatism is really important right now. I saw was the FDA or somebody had loosened restrictions on using remote tools for telehealth, for example. So they changed the rules to say you don't have to have a HIPAA compliant connection to a patient as long as you're acting in good faith. And I think some of that stuff, maybe I haven't thought about this deeply, but maybe that kind of concept applies in the enterprise, which is, assume that people are acting in good faith and introducing tools and systems in order to be helpful. Maybe lean your governance in that direction right now.
Yeah, and also
the next one is
like
go ahead. Go ahead, Martin.
Also, unfortunately, with any question like that, I also am faced with, it's going to be a balance of these things, and the balance is going to be different depending on the organization and the problem and the thing that you've got. There's no absolute answers to any of those things that you prioritize. And unfortunately, that's the case. And it's impossible to give a general answer.
The next one is, how do we deal with intentional centralization of workforce now that we have seen the weakness of that model, especially to help strategize a more flexible, intelligent model?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's sort of, I can give a couple of thoughts. I think organizational resilience is hugely important because, this is a global pandemic, but this is not the only kind of thing that can go wrong globally. There are natural disasters, there's the occasional volcano that spews ash everywhere and nobody can get on a plane. This is not the only thing that can go wrong. And so having thought about those scenarios and understanding what you might do is half the battle, is to actually have done the thought exercise and to say, what really is the risk of these things happening? And therefore, how much do we want to centralize and co-locate our workforce? I am hopeful that organizations are going after this to lead to more flexible situations where they are more comfortable having people able to work flexibly. That was really our whole distributed by default thing that we were doing was more about flexibility than absolutes. So we would do things where, for example, teams would do 1 week on site, 2 weeks, say, at a Thoughtworks location somewhere else. And that gives a whole bunch of benefits in terms of flexibility, but also, even reduce cost because you're not paying to fly people around all the time.
So again, to switch it around slightly, remember that different models work for different people. Many teams are going to be better all at one location. And in fact, I would argue that most teams are going to perform better if co-located than if they are distributed, because the kinds of particularly informal interactions that go on are more effective. The difference is that you've got to, if you want to deal with a crisis like this, it's good to be able to switch to remote operation when necessary. But also, of course, you will find better people, a better range of people, if you're able to operate on a remote first basis. So you may be able to get a better performing team remote first because you can get people that you couldn't get to put into the centralized location. But there's no perfect answer for everyone. I mean, there's a lot of people that will not like and do not like working from home. They don't have the setup. They don't have the facilities to work from home. They don't have a nice enough house. I'm lucky. I've got effectively a full-time office. It's really, really nice. But a lot of people don't have that. And even if they do have the facilities, they may just not like working from home. It doesn't suit their way of working very well. So I don't think there's any best answers here. There's going to be a different range of things, and we have to remember that different people are different.
It's not a terrible idea for a future topic within this series to talk through some of the options and where it is a good thing to have folks working remote, where others need to be co-located. And to Martin, your point around it varies and it depends on a lot of different scenarios. So to talk through some of those dependencies, and Mike talked about why we did distributed, and talk about the reasons that apply for specific companies and why they would want to do it. So potentially a good one. This will be the last question. If we can answer this one quickly for today. Are you seeing customers invest in things like systems to help diversify supply chains and or measure how much fragility is in said systems, supply chain systems, not just the tech parts, but the design of the overall system as well?
I would have to defer to our supply chain experts. I know we work with a number of companies who are supply chain led. I would imagine that they are looking very hard at all of those systems right now because the theme for me is that any of those pressures that you were feeling before this crisis, all of those dials just got turned up to 11, and you are definitely dealing with that right now.
Yeah, I think it's going to do some interesting things to people thinking about supply chain resilience. Although, and in the longer term, this is going to count as well. I mean, I certainly see it's likely that will be increasing tension between China and the US in the future. And that's irrelevant to the current leadership of the US, because even that suspicion and the concern about links to China is more than just within the current Republican leadership. It's right across the political spectrum. And I think that's going to be a real challenge with supply chains that involve China in the future. And that's going to be a long-term risk, not just short-term ones. It's going to require many people to look at their supply chains and see, and they've got to go deeper than just their immediate suppliers, right? You've got to go all the way but through to get a sense of where are my bits coming from and how do I organize that? So I would imagine people are going to do that kind of rethinking even without the COVID crisis. And this is just going to be a little bit of acceleration on that. And I suspect there's also going to be a good deal more nationalism in the sense of, well, we don't really want key drugs and key medical equipment being restricted because they're being done by other countries. And I suspect that's going to come up as well. But exactly how that's going to play out, I don't know, because I'm not a supply chain guy. I'm just reading The Economist.
Yep. I think that's fair, and that's a good segue into hopefully everybody's enjoyed what they've heard, and it's just a conversation for 50 minutes here is not one where we can dig into details, but hopefully you've heard some things that are valuable for you and your organization, and some of the folks that have heard these today are going to be able to take the learnings and the topics that you heard us discussing today, and you can go execute on those, and you can improve and you can adapt, and you'll be able to take all of these lessons learned on your own. Others are going to need some help, whether that be because you've got diminished capacity in this current situation, or you just simply need that expertise. And I want to let everybody know that Thoughtworks is here to help in any way that we can, not only in our standard model of helping you become a more modern digital business, but we've taken these topics that we're discussing today and we've brought them in-house and adjusted some of our offerings, whether that be coming up with new ways to do agile coaching so that we can help you through these times where you're struggling, coming up with offerings directly dedicated to remote working and beyond the BAU that we talked about earlier, but remote governance and facilitation and other things, the digital triage and technical assessments that will help you get through this time and plan for what's next. Mike alluded to the digital fluency model exercise and the targeted, more specific version of that as it relates to near-term value add. All of those are tweaks that Thoughtworks has made to the building blocks of a modern digital business that apply to the current situation. So please go to the thoughtworks.com, contact us page, reach out. We're happy to answer the remainder of the questions that are here in the chat, and we will do that. But if you have more inquiries or just want to talk with us, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help in this situation, and we would love the opportunity to partner with you. So thank you all for joining. I appreciate your time. Mike and Martin, thank you so much for your time.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.